Hey crystal lovers, Ashley Levy here with the Love and Light School of Crystal Therapy, and in this training video I'm going to be teaching you how to identify your tumbled stones when they all look the same. And we're going to be talking about black, white, and clear stones in this video. So let's start with our black stones because these are some of the trickiest, and I hear from my students all the time how they always have trouble telling, do I have a black tourmaline or a black onyx or a black obsidian? How do I know? Well, let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to give you some tips for how to tell these stones apart. So let's start with black tourmaline. Now, black tourmaline is a beautiful stone, and a lot of the tumbled material that you see comes from Brazil or China. Now, the black tourmaline in and of itself has a really kind of glassy looking appearance when it has a nice high polish on it, like you see in most tumbled stones. Now, something to look for on the surface of the stone, you often see tiny pits or little, they almost looks like little chips missing out of the surface of the stone. Now those aren't actually chips from the tumbling or polishing process or because the stone has been damaged in any way. In fact, these are natural to the formation of the stone. So black tourmaline forms in these striated crystals, and so when it's then tumbled or polished, sometimes where those grooves or striations were dipped down below the line where the rest of the stone was polished. So you actually see these little cracks or fissures or little chippy looking things in the surface of the stone. Now black tourmaline is kind of a medium weight stone as well. It's not super heavy, but it's definitely not lightweight. So that kind of helps you rule out some other things. Now the next stone that people get this mixed up for is black onyx. Now black onyx, similar to calcite, has almost a waxy feel to it. It's a very soft stone in comparison to something like tourmaline, which is very hard. So black onyx has this kind of waxy or soapy kind of feeling and texture, and often its color is just a little bit duller when you see it in tumbled stones. Now black onyx is used in jewelry, usually has a very, very high polish on it, and so it's very shiny. It looks almost like obsidian, but in a lot of tumbled stones, you're looking at more of a mid-grade quality of onyx, and so it does tend to be a little bit more of a charcoal gray rather than a true black. Of course, you can get really, really high quality stuff that is a little bit darker in color, but it won't have those same grooves that most black tourmaline has. Now another stone that people get confused with this group is black obsidian. Now the best and easiest way to tell that you have black obsidian is because it's very lightweight. So black onyx and black obsidian, if the black onyx is really high quality, the black obsidian can look very similar, but in comparison, black obsidian is very, very lightweight because it's a natural glass, so it's not nearly as heavy as tourmaline or onyx would be. Now another thing about obsidian is that it just looks glassy, as a very, very high reflective quality to the surface. Now all these stones are black and they're all opaque, so you can't see any light through them, but black obsidian, really easy to tell apart because of that weight difference from your other stones. Now there's also jet. Now jet, similar to obsidian, can be very lightweight, but jet is a little bit more of a silvery charcoal gray color rather than a true black. So if you compare a piece of jet and a piece of obsidian, there is usually a little color difference. Now there are some kinds of jet that are a true black color. In particular, there's jet out of Tibet that's a beautiful kind of true black color, but it's not so glassy looking, not so shiny like obsidian. In fact, it's more of a matte black even when it's been tumbled or polished. Now that takes us to hematite. Now hematite is the opposite of obsidian and jet. It's actually quite heavy for its size because it's composed mostly of iron, and it's actually a silvery metallic black color. It can be confused in appearance with shungite when shungite has been tumbled and polished, because shungite can take on a little bit more of a silvery black metallic color, but shungite will be quite lightweight rather than the really heavy metallic hematite. Now, I talked about black obsidian a little bit earlier. There's actually also snowflake obsidian. And snowflake obsidian is that beautiful glassy black, but then it also has white phenocrysts that look like little snowflakes all over the surface of the stone. Sometimes these are really large and sometimes they're really small and they look more like polka dots, but it's really easy to tell this stone because of those white markings. Now there's also tektite. Tektite is another glassy mineral, and tektite is really easy to identify when it's been tumbled because it has large craters in it. So like I mentioned before, black tourmaline will have little chips and sometimes little fissures or cracks kind of along the surface of the stone. Tektite really has large, bubbly looking craters on the surface of the stone. And this is just very common because of the way that tektites are formed. These stones, once they're tumbled, will have these large pitted craters in the surface. So it makes them very easy to distinguish from other black stones. Now that takes us to our clear stones. I'm going to focus on three main ones here, and I know that there are lots and lots of clear stones out there, but these are the most common that you see available in tumbled stones on the commercial market, and they can get a little bit difficult to identify from one another. So clear quartz is the first one I want to talk about. Quartz is very easy to identify most of the time because it's very hard, it's transparent to sometimes translucent, sometimes it can be a little bit more milky, then it will take on a white color rather than a clear color. And clear quartz usually has some veils or wisps or little inclusions inside that kind of distinguish it from other minerals. Clear calcite, on the other hand, will be very, very clear in color and often has tiny rainbows along its planes of cleavage. I talked about this in the video about yellow stones when I was talking about golden calcite. Clear calcite, very, very similar here, has tons of rainbows usually, and that's a great identifier. And these rainbows look a little bit different than the rainbows that you'll sometimes see in clear quartz crystals, which are often found along natural fissures or fractures within the stone. The rainbows in clear calcite are a little bit more spread evenly throughout the stone. And finally, that brings me to apophyllite. Now, apophyllite can be almost impossible to distinguish from these other two crystals once it has been tumbled and polished. But the good news is you don't find tumbled clear apophyllite very often. You do come across it from time to time, but it's not a super common to find it this way because it is really pretty brittle, so it can be difficult to polish into a tumbled stone. Now, one thing to look for with apophyllite is that it actually has kind of a reflective quality to it that is almost a bit silvery. So it's very almost glassy looking, and it has this reflection that if you get it in the right angle, it's almost like an entire sheet of silver. It's almost mirror-like. So it's really kind of interesting just to consider the difference in that quality versus the clear quartz or clear calcite. Now finally, that takes me to our white stones. And again, I know there are tons of white stones out there, but I want to focus on two that people often get mistaken. And those are selenite and scolecite. So these look very similar because they both form long striated crystals. But selenite is primarily from Central and South America, and Morocco is where you find some of the most beautiful selenite. And in fact, most of the selenite that's commercially available comes from Morocco. But in selenite, the striations on the crystal, so those grooved lines that you won't see in a tumbled stone, all go horizontal. So they're all parallel to one another. Now in a scolecite, the grooves or striations are actually formed because there are tiny little needles of crystals that grow together more in a fan shape. So they're starting at one base and growing outward rather than just growing in these long crystals. So what's really interesting here is that when scolecite is tumbled, it's almost completely solid white. At least most of what's available. And this is because the lower grade scolecite from India is usually what's prepared into tumbled stones. The really high quality stuff, the really transparent stuff, is usually reserved to be sold as specimen pieces. Whereas selenite, that's coming out of Morocco mostly, like I said, when it has been polished, it will look white from one angle, but it's almost a brighter white. Scolecite is kind of a creamy ivory white. Selenite is a bright silvery white. Another interesting thing to look for in your tumbled selenite is look for kind of a optical quality to it, a fiber optic quality to it. So if you look at selenite from one direction, you'll just be looking at the side of those striated crystals. But if you look down the length of the striated crystal, you can actually see clear through the other end, almost like a TV rock or a ulexite stone. So this is a really interesting quality that you see when you're looking through tumbled selenites. You can usually see through one direction of the stone, and it's not that you can really see through clearly as if you were looking through a telescope or something like that, but you will be able to see light coming through for sure. So I hope that that has helped you identify your black and white crystals. I know that it can be challenging, but stick with it. You've made it through this video series. Hopefully you've gotten some really great tips, and I hope you've been able to identify a few of those mystery crystals in your healing toolkit. Until next time, I'm Ashley Levy of the Love and Light School of Crystal Therapy. Crystal blessings.